Hello, my name is Sarah, and I am reading a ghost story called Secret City by Jan Andrew Henderson. And this is chapter 6, The Giant. The next morning, Charlie burst into the big top in a state of high excitement. Lily was balancing 3 chairs, one on top of each other, on the end of her chin. I read the diary last night. Well, some of it. It was amazing. Just like I was there. In fact, I don't even know if I dreamt it. He stopped mid-tirade. Oh, is that not a bit heavy? It is just an illusion, Lily said without taking her eyes off the chairs. You seem very animated this morning. It's this diary. It was written by a boy called Peasel, a real boy from 200 years ago. He had a best friend, Duncan. He'd come down from the Highlands to look for work in Edinburgh. Charlie spread his arms, trying to convey the enormity of what he was saying. It wasn't like I was reading, it was like I was seeing what went on. It must be quite a book. You don't understand. I can't explain it, but somehow I'm not just reading it. The book had only sketchy details and I only read a couple of pages, but I still know what went on in their lives. Stuff that's not even written down. Charlie pulled the diary from his rucksack. Listen, I've got to go to Greyfriars Graveyard. Lily jerked her head back and the chairs collapsed in perfect formation, stacking neatly as they landed. Charlie blinked. Why Greyfriars Graveyard? She said sharply. I want to see where Peasel liked to hang out. He used to write on a grave of some guy called Alan Ramsay. Duncan liked it too because it had hawks, just like in the Highlands. Hawks? Lily scowled. Well, one hawk, white with black-tipped wings. Charlie held up the book. You want to come? No, I don't. The girl turned sharply away. I have to practice. Are you all right? Charlie said. But Lily had begun to juggle again, 7 balls, then 8, then 10, so fast it was merely a blur. She didn't turn round as he left, and he got the strange feeling that the girl was suddenly upset and was trying to hide it. Greyfriars was only a few hundred yards from the old town, but you could walk straight past it without knowing it, for the cemetery was hidden by a high wall and was still ringed by old buildings. Charlie was lucky to spot the entrance, set back from the street, behind a pub and a row of small shops. He let out a gasp as he walked through the wrought iron gates. Dotted between the trees were lovingly carved gravestones, now weathered with age, and behind that, a high backdrop of grey Georgian tenements, exactly as he had seen them the night before. The boy walked round the side of the squat barn-like church that faced the gates. There was the flat tombstone that marked the final resting place of Alan Ramsay, right where he knew it would be. This is more than a little weird, Charlie muttered to himself, taking the journal from his bag. The flat worn stone was warm from the summer sun, and on impulse he lay down on it, looking around to see if anyone disapproved. But the graveyard, hidden behind its double barricade, seemed to be deserted, so Charlie opened the book and began to read. Sunday is the only day when Duncan does not work at a factory, so we arranged to meet on the high street in the afternoon, for in the morning he was paying his respects to a gypsy girl who sings for money in Blair Street and with whom he is much taken. I was in powerful good spirits, for I had relieved more than one rich merchant of his gold snuff box that week. Peasel walked slowly down the high street looking out for Duncan. Like all thoroughfares in the old town, the high street was packed with people, strolling and gossiping, and it smelt strongly of sewage. For the ground was not paved, and waste and rubbish was often thrown out of the windows at night. The air was filled with the shouts of fruit sellers and fishwives plying their wares from rickety wooden stalls, planted in the stagnant mud. He finally found Duncan, sitting on a stone stoop and looking glum. I presume things didn't go entirely well with your girl this morning. Peasel hunkered down beside his friend, trying to look sympathetic. She's no my girl, a pretty lassie whose company I like. Duncan poked dejectedly in the mud with his foot. I'm fond of her and she can sing love ballads fit to break a heart. But I'm a plain-spoken lad and not much for romantic talk. Well, don't ask me for advice because I'm too scrawny for courting. You fancy a bag of buckies? Peasel pointed to a stall selling little saucers of cockles covered with salt and pepper. I didn't want to eat anything that looked like it came out of somebody's nose, the Highlander grunted. Peasel bought a saucer anyway. He had taken to hanging around Edinburgh's bookstalls to hear what the learned gentlemen who browsed there were saying. Usually he didn't understand a word, but he could grab a silk handkerchief or a gold coin from their back pockets as they strolled by. Last week, the pickpocket had overheard one gent saying that eating fish made people smarter, and he decided that seafood was his best bet for getting an education. Since cockles were the only kind of marine life that he could actually afford, Peasel had taken to eating them whenever he got the chance. The two boys sat on a cracked step while Peasel shovelled cold, slimy shellfish into his mouth and Duncan glowered at the thronging crowds. The Highlander badly missed the solitude of his heather-covered moors. Here he could only see slivers of sky between the tenement blocks, and even those thin patches were tainted by thick palls of chimney smoke. Duncan would have liked to get out to the grimy, overcrowded city for the day, but Peasel insisted that he was scared of the countryside. The pickpocket had lived his whole life in the slums, and he wasn't about to venture into the wilderness where he might get eaten by a wild animal, especially a camel. Peasel was deadly afraid of camels. "There is no camels in the Scottish countryside, I am sure of it," Duncan muttered. "Have you ever seen a camel?" Peasel asked. "I don't even know what a camel looks like." Well, there you go then," said Peasel triumphantly. "The countryside could be full of man-eating camels and you wouldn't know it." Duncan wouldn't give up. "We could go and climb up Arthur's Seat." The Highlander pointed south to where the craggy hilltop could be glimpsed through the swirling smoke in the chimney pots. "It's not exactly the countryside now, is it, if you can see it from here?" Peasel looked to his friend in horror. "You must be joking. When that thing blows up, I don't want to be standing on top of it." Idling outside his favourite bookstall the week before, Peasel had been horrified to hear two learned gents talking about Arthur's Seat being an extinct volcano with a vast network of tunnels underneath. Once he'd asked around and found out what a volcano was, Peasel vowed never to set foot on the hill again. He was still trying to find out what extinct meant, though. He half-heartedly offered the Highlander a cockle, but Duncan waved it away with a snort. Peasel could see that his friend was in a foul mood, but he wasn't about to go climbing over a volcano just to cheer him up. Duncan sighed loudly. "Tell you what," the pickpocket said finally. "I will buy us some decent food for tonight, eh? I've had a good week and it is time to sell what I've acquired." He wiped his greasy hands down his trousers and inspected his nimble fingers with pride. "I mean, we'll have to go back to the underground city for a bit, if you don't mind. If I'm getting something other than boiled turnip for supper, I'm willing to trek through the very gates of hell." "Funny you should say that," Peasel grinned awkwardly as he stood. "Come on, let's get this over with." Duncan's mood was black as they marched back to the shadows of the South Bridge, stepping out of the sunlight and entering the familiar dark corridor that led to their vault. This time, however, the boys continued past the rude dwelling and carried on down the passageway. The Highlander had never been in this direction before. He spent as much time as he could on the surface, and he had no inclination to delve deeper into the black, smelly corridors. "Never thought we'd end up back here on my day off," he muttered, tripping over a sleeping figure curled up on the tunnel floor. The passages, like every other part of Edinburgh, were festooned with down-and-outs who slept when they felt like it. Why not? In the permanent darkness of the underground city, it was always night. "Here we are," Peasel whispered finally, crouching beside a damp wall. "There's a set of stairs behind a little opening down here. Most people don't even know it exists." His hunched form moved forward, and without warning, he was gone. Puzzled, Duncan shuffled one near invisible foot around in front of him where the wall met the floor and felt a small opening. He could have passed by it 100 times in the blackness without even realising it was there. He sat down, wriggling his body through the gap and leaning carefully on the slimy wall, inched slowly down a hidden stairway, feeling for each new step with his foot. There was another tunnel at the bottom of the stairway, and it seemed even darker than the one he had left, though Duncan didn't suppose that this was actually possible. He heard a scratching noise to his right, and Peasel's triumphant expression was lit by a crackling flame. "Torches!" the pickpocket said proudly, waving a stout stick that dripped flaming tar in alarming amounts. "Made 'em myself. You never know when the old town guard will raid the place and I might have to make a quick getaway." Duncan sighed. Edinburgh's old town guard were mostly ex-soldiers, well over retirement age. It was unlikely that they would bother raiding a den of vice like the underground city, and they weren't likely to catch more than a cold if they did. In the light of the firebrand, the Highlander could see the stonework in the area was much older and cruder than the tunnels above, and the walls shone with waterlogged moss. The smell was different too, not the stink of stale sweat and smoke that filled most of the chambers, but a wet, earthy smell that reminded Duncan of the caves underneath Highland waterfalls. Peasel moved away again and Duncan followed, touching the walls and sniffing his fingers. "That's not bad, actually," he grinned. "Peaceful, you ken. I can't hear anyone. Why does nobody live down here?" "It's too damp and cold, even for beggars and drunks," Peasel said. "As far as I know, there's only one person staying on this whole level, and that is who we're going to see." "And who might that be?" "His name is Shadow Jack Henry, a blacksmith by trade. He moved down here a couple of months ago. There's a well at the end of this level that's been blocked up for as long as anyone can remember. So Shadow Jack set up a wee forge and opened the well to draw water for it. He makes metal trinkets and sells them to the market traders on the high street. The forge makes the vault warm enough to live in, and there's no one else down here to pay rent to. A nice wee setup, if you ask me." "Sounds like it," Duncan agreed. "How is it that I've never heard anyone mention him before?" "You know how superstitious ignorant people are," said Peasel, as if he had the benefit of an Oxford education. "There is some old legend about the well being haunted," he continued with a laugh. "Something about it leading straight down to hell." Duncan stopped. "Let's go back." Peasel turned in astonishment. What's the matter?" "I'm not going into any haunted place," said Duncan matter-of-factly. "What?" Peasel spluttered. "I thought Highlanders weren't scared of man nor beast. At least that's what you keep telling me about 50 times a day." "Haunted stuff isn't man nor beast." Duncan shook his head. "Haunted stuff is witches and kelpies and the little people. In the Highlands, you didn't mess with creatures like that. Especially the little people." He folded his arms in determination. "I can't believe that you, of all people, would come down here. You that is scared of anything that moves." "I'm scared of camels and volcanoes, but that is scientific stuff," Peasel explained. "This is the 19th century, Duncan. There is no such thing as little people," he sniffed. "Most of the trouble we get is from big people." Duncan shook his head in exasperation, but he was fiercely loyal to his friend, and after a stream of disapproving grunts, he finally indicated to keep going. For a while, the two boys walked without talking, the only sound being Peasel's tatty old boots crunching on loose stones and the rasp of his breathing. The pickpocket had to keep stopping to catch his breath, for a lifetime of sleeping in the underground city and a diet of turnip and salted beef hadn't done much for his health. Duncan didn't try to hurry him, for the wiry Highlander was concerned about his frail friend and wasn't all that keen to get to where they were heading anyway. Unlike Peasel, Duncan moved silently, as he'd learnt to do whilst he was stalking deer. Only now he walked without a sound in case something was creeping up on him. Eventually, a flickering glow appeared at the far end of the tunnel, and they could hear a muffled clanging like a bell, growing louder as they walked. Peasel stopped and gave a long whistle. The ringing stopped. After a few seconds, they heard a similar whistle coming from the direction of the light, and Peasel signalled for Duncan that they could carry on. At the end of the passageway, the boys turned a corner and a blast of hot, smoke-filled air seared their faces. They stepped from the dark passageway into the bright chamber and came upon a sight that would have confirmed the worst fears of the other underground dwellers. Shadow Jack Henry stood in the middle of a red, shimmering vault, stripped to the waist and swinging a huge hammer. He was so large that he made Merry Andrew look like a midget, and his massive torso, shining with exertion, bore the livid wheals of 100 healed burns. He brought the hammer down on the glowing metal rod that he was shaping, and a shower of dazzling sparks flew into the air, vanishing into the fierce radiance that emanated from the blacksmith's forge. Over the fire, a large metal smelting dish was suspended on a pole between two wooden tripods, powerful flames licking its sooty sides. "My God," whispered Duncan, "we're in the doorway to Hades itself." Shadow Jack looked round. Huge teeth split his bushy black beard as he grinned at the pickpocket. "Peasel, my lad," He dropped the hammer with a clang, raised his sweaty hand in greeting. The smile vanished as he caught sight of Duncan. "Ah, I see you have brought a visitor." Shadowjack Henry flexed his considerable muscles, and two bushy eyebrows closed ranks on his sweaty forehead. "I don't get many visitors," he said coldly, "being a private sort of person." "This is Duncan MacPhail," said the pickpocket, pointing to the Highlander. "Don't worry, he's a good friend and one that I would trust with my life." "That's the type of friend that you want, right enough," said the giant smith, looking at the Highlander up and down before turning back to Peasel. "So what have you brought for me, my little man?" he said, suddenly brusque and businesslike. The pickpocket pulled a canvas bag from under his shirt and emptied the contents onto the vault floor. 4 snuff boxes glinted in the iridescent light. Shadowjack had knelt down and inspected them. "Solid gold and good quality too. They will make a pretty puddle once they're melted done. Well done, lad." He went to a pile of bedding in the corner of the vault and rummaged inside. "I will give you 4 shillings for the lot, as I am in an uncommonly generous mood." The blacksmith smiled thinly and folded a few coins into Peasel's hand, his massive fingers enveloping the boys like a shark swallowing a minnow. Shadowjack cast a sideways look at Duncan just to see if he had any opinion on the price, but the Highlander was staring into the well. It looked harmless enough. Just a round hole in the corner of the vault floor with yet another wooden frame and a pulley built over it. A stout rope and a bucket sat nearby. "Is this where you draw the water to work your forge?" "It is, boy," the blacksmith nodded. "And there are those who would like nothing better than for me to block that hole up again, but I am far too big to argue with." He motioned with his hand. "Don't fall in, though, for I won't venture down to rescue you." "Don't worry, we're just going." Peasel was wafting the air in vain, his face already running with sweat. "Let's get out of here, Duncan, before I faint dead away with the heat." The Highlander was still trying to peer into the darkness of the well, and Peasel grasped his arm, ushering him quickly out into the vault. Shadowjack didn't bother to say goodbye. "He doesn't much like company, especially strangers," the pickpocket said, as the red glow faded away behind them. He showed Duncan the pile of shillings. "But I told you we'd eat well tonight." That well back there," Duncan paused. "You can hear running water at the bottom." "So what?" "Well, in a water doesn't run anywhere. What I heard was a stream." "And that means?" Peasel looked none the wiser. "Thought you were the scientific one," the Highlander scoffed. "It means the water down there is coming from somewhere and going somewhere." He patted Peasel on the shoulder. "It means that there's another level underneath this one." Charlie sat up with a start, not sure if he'd been dreaming or simply lost in his own thoughts. The sun had gone behind the cloud, and Alan Ramsay's tombstone, wrapped in afternoon shadows, was now cold against his skin. He sat up quickly and closed the journal. Charlie knew exactly where Shadowjack Henry had once worked, for he had been in that very chamber the day before and seen the remains of the blacksmith's forge. He recalled the discarded tripod, the stone circle, the pile of stones he'd removed. Must have been the covering for the well, sealed by some sort of iron plug. And just as well, for hadn't the terrifying drumming noise come from somewhere underneath it? Oh, Charlie shivered again. He didn't like to think the sensation had much to do with the temperature this time. All the same, he looked up to see where the sun had gone, and his shiver turned into a gasp. Floating far above his head was a white hawk with black-tipped wings. Right, I'm going to stop there. I want you to clean your teeth. I want you to wash your hands. Get yourselves into your bed. Give yourself a great big huge cuddle, because you deserve it. And hopefully I'll see you again tomorrow night. Night-night.